You think you know who you are. You carry this image of yourself through every decision, every relationship, every quiet moment alone. But what if that image is a lie? Not because you're dishonest, but because you built it from fragments of what others needed you to be. A man from Oak Park, Illinois, spent 12 years watching children break under the weight of their parents' expectations before he understood the mechanism. His name was Carl Rogers, born January 8, 1902. And between 1928 and 1940, working at the Rochester Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, he documented something no one else had seen. The self isn't discovered, it's constructed. And most people spend their entire lives trapped inside a construction that was never theirs to begin with. What did Rogers see in those therapy rooms? How did his observations reshape the entire field of psychology? And why does his sixth-ranked position among the most eminent psychologists of the 20th century rest on an idea so simple it sounds obvious until you try to live it? Straight A student. Tests near the top on every intellectual aptitude measure. His father buys a farm. The boy learns scientific agriculture, experimental methods, controlled observation. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he starts with agriculture, then history, then theology. 1922, age 20, 5-month trip to China with the World Student Christian Federation. Returns questioning everything his parents taught him. Marries Helen Elliott after a nearly 2-year engagement. They move to New York. He enrolls at Union Theological Seminary, a liberal institution that encourages free thought. So much free thought that within 2 years, he rejects specific religious doctrine entirely, switches to Columbia University Teachers College, studies under William Kilpatrick, absorbs John Dewey's philosophy that experience forms the basis of learning. 1931, PhD in clinical psychology. No warning that this man would rank 6th among all 20th century psychologists, second only to Sigmund Freud among clinical psychologists in a study by Hagbloom using 6 criteria, including citations and recognition. No indication that he would receive the American Psychological Association Award for Distinguished Scientific Contributions in 1956, then the Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions in 1972. The foundations were invisible. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, drawing directly from Rogers' 1951 text, Client-Centered Therapy, published by Constable in London, his 1957 paper in the Journal of Consulting Psychology, titled The Necessary and Sufficient Conditions of Therapeutic Personality Change, and archival documentation from the University of Chicago Counseling Center, founded in 1945, where Rogers conducted thousands of recorded therapy sessions. These aren't secondary summaries. These are the original sources where Rogers formulated his 19 propositions and outlined the phenomenological field concept that became the foundation of humanistic psychology. Now, back to the information. Rogers joins the Child Study Department of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children while still completing his doctoral thesis. He becomes director of the Society's Child Guidance Center in 1930. For 12 years, he works with socially disadvantaged families, testing protocols, diagnostic labels, 75-page case histories, exhaustive batteries of tests before treatment begins. Standard procedure. Freudian framework dominates the assumption. The therapist knows what's wrong, interprets the unconscious conflict, prescribes the solution. Rogers follows the model until he doesn't. Somewhere between 1930 and 1939, during those 12 years at Rochester, something shifts. He starts noticing that rigid diagnoses don't predict outcomes. Prescriptive advice from therapists doesn't consistently foster lasting change. The clients who improve aren't the ones following directions. They're the ones finding their own path. Rogers watches, documents, records. He sees children crumbling under conditional love, parents who only approve when the child performs correctly, families where acceptance comes with terms and conditions. He sees the pattern. The child learns to suppress genuine feelings, to present a false self that earns approval, to split their experienced reality from their presented reality. The gap between who they are and who they pretend to be widens. Anxiety builds, defenses multiply, the person becomes rigid, fragile, psychologically vulnerable. The book documents his 12 years of clinical work. It acknowledges Otto Rank, Jesse Taft, Frederick Allen, pioneers of relationship therapy who emphasized the patient's self-insight over the therapist's interpretation. Rogers introduces his developing point of view. The book brings him enough notice to land a full professorship at Ohio State University in 1940. He teaches mental hygiene, counseling practices, guides doctoral students through dissertations, and he does something no other therapist has done. He records therapy sessions with clients and offers them for study. First therapist ever. The sessions become data. Rogers and his graduate student Bernard Kovner analyze the recordings. They develop measurement systems. How directive is the therapist? How much does the counselor's attitude shape the client's decisions? Research by Elias Porter in 1941 at Ohio State uses Rogers' transcripts to quantify non-directiveness. The evidence mounts. The therapist's orientation matters more than technique. The book includes the first published verbatim transcript of a full psychotherapy case. Revolutionary. The book shifts emphasis from diagnosis to therapy, from the therapist as expert to the therapist as facilitator. Rogers calls it non-directive therapy. The reaction splits psychology. Conservative therapists see it as threatening established techniques. Others seize on it with enthusiasm. Fresh approach. Different assumptions about human nature. At Ohio State, Rogers teaches his students to question the authoritative model. He tells them the client knows what's important, the client can determine direction after receiving therapy, the person seeking help isn't a dependent patient but a responsible client. The terminology matters. Client, not patient. Partners, not doctor and sick person. Humans in distress aren't necessarily sick. They're incongruent. Their self-concept doesn't match their experience. The process of counseling becomes visible. Rogers moves from believing technique matters most to understanding that attitude matters more. Reflecting feelings is useless unless the therapist's acceptance and understanding are genuine. He experiments with power sharing, trusts his staff the way he trusts clients, implements person-centered administration more fully than at any other time in his life. The counseling center becomes a laboratory. Rogers observes, measures, refines. The book presents 19 propositions, a complete theory of personality and behavior, phenomenological in character, based on the concept of self as an explanatory construct. The propositions describe how individuals exist in a continually changing world of experience, the phenomenal field of which they are the center. Each person reacts to the field as experienced and perceived. This perceptual field is reality for the individual. The organism reacts as an organized whole. The organism has one basic tendency, to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. Behavior is the goal-directed attempt to satisfy needs as experienced in the field as perceived. Every proposition builds on the one before. Proposition 7. As experiences occur in the life of the individual, they are either symbolized, perceived, and organized into some relationship to the self, ignored because there is no perceived relationship to the self structure, or denied symbolization or given a distorted symbolization because the experience is inconsistent with the structure of the self. That's the mechanism of incongruence. Experiences that threaten the self-concept get distorted or denied. The person cannot admit them into awareness because acknowledging them would shatter the carefully constructed image of who they believe they are. Proposition 14. Psychological maladjustment exists when the organism denies to awareness significant sensory and visceral experiences, which consequently are not symbolized and organized into the gestalt of the self-structure. When thus denied, they create a basis for potential psychological tension. The gap between experienced reality and self-concept generates anxiety. If achieved, this represents freedom from internal strain and anxiety, freedom from potential strain, maximum realistically oriented adaptation, establishment of an individualized value system having considerable identity with the value system of any other equally well-adapted member of the human race. Congruence. That's the goal. Not adjustment to social norms, not conformity to external expectations. Congruence between what you experience and who you believe yourself to be. The gap kills people slowly. Rogers saw it in Rochester. Children who learned their feelings were unacceptable, who developed conditions of worth where love came only when they met parental standards. They grew into adults perpetually seeking external approval, never trusting their own experience, never achieving congruence. If understanding how Rogers arrived at this theory interests you, subscribe. We're documenting the mental process, not just the outcome. Comment your city. This research pulls from Rogers' 1959 chapter, A Theory of Therapy Personality and Interpersonal Relationships, as developed in the Client-Centered Framework published in Psychology, a study of a science edited by Koch and released by McGraw-Hill, alongside his 1961 book On Becoming a Person, published by Constable in London, which became his most popular work and the Bible of the humanistic psychology movement. We're cross-referencing his theoretical propositions with the documented clinical outcomes from the thousands of recorded therapy sessions at Chicago. Now back to the information. The chapter on theory of personality and behavior formalizes his contribution to what becomes known as third force psychology, a complex set of alternatives to behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Rogers comments in the book, like Maslow, the writer would confess that in the early portion of his professional life, he held a theoretical view opposed at almost every point to the view he has gradually come to adopt as a result of clinical experience and clinically oriented research. He changed his mind based on evidence. 12 years at Rochester, clinical observation, recorded sessions at Ohio State, thousands of hours of transcripts at Chicago. The data forced him to abandon his training. Another student, Eugene Gendlin, develops the psychotherapeutic method of focusing based on Rogerian listening. The influence spreads beyond therapy rooms. If these 6 conditions exist and continue over a period of time, constructive personality change will follow. No other conditions are necessary. The 6. Psychological contact between client and therapist. Client in a state of incongruence, being vulnerable or anxious. Therapist congruent or integrated in the relationship. Therapist experiencing unconditional positive regard for the client. Therapist experiencing an empathic understanding of the client's internal frame of reference and endeavoring to communicate this experience to the client, the communication to the client of the therapist's empathic understanding and unconditional positive regard is to a minimal degree achieved. These conditions are sufficient, not techniques, not interpretation, not advice, conditions of relationship. A caring for the client as a separate person with permission to have his own feelings, his own experiences. Not approval, not agreement, acceptance. The client doesn't have to earn regard by behaving correctly. The client is valued simply for being. This counters the conditions of worth most people internalize in childhood. Parents who love conditionally, who withdraw affection when the child misbehaves, who praise only achievement. The child learns, I'm valuable when I perform, worthless when I fail. The belief becomes foundational. The adult spends life seeking external validation, never feeling secure, never trusting their own judgment. Rogers hypothesizes that experiencing unconditional positive regard from a therapist allows the client to develop unconditional self-regard, to accept themselves without conditions, to begin trusting their own experience. Rogers considers this the most essential condition. Neither positive regard nor empathy could be meaningful, he thinks, unless they are real. The therapist must be integrated and genuine within the therapeutic encounter. No professional facade, no pretense. The therapist must be willing to be transparently himself, to express the feelings and attitudes flowing within at the moment. If the therapist feels bored, acknowledging it can deepen the relationship more than faking interest. If the therapist feels confused, saying so invites the client to clarify. Congruence doesn't mean expressing every passing emotion. It means the therapist's inner experience matches their outer presentation. The client encounters a real person, not a role player. This gives the client permission to be equally real. Rogers describes sensing the client's private world as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as-if quality. The therapist enters the client's frame of reference, perceives what the client perceives, feels what the client feels, but remains separate. The therapist doesn't become the client. The therapist walks alongside, understanding without judging, clarifying without directing. This requires laying aside the therapist's own values, theories, and preconceptions. The therapist can't be thinking about diagnosis while trying to understand the client's subjective experience. The therapist must be fully present, attentive, listening, not for what's wrong, but for what is. He later calls this period the most painful and anguished episode in my whole professional life. Conflicts within the psychology department. Efforts to integrate research and training across psychology, psychiatry, and social work prove frustrating. Rogers grows disillusioned. But during these 7 years, he publishes On Becoming a Person in 1961. The book becomes his popular breakthrough. Essays exploring therapy, personal development, pursuit of the good life. The title captures Rogers' core insight, becoming, not being. Personality isn't fixed. The self isn't static. People are always in process, continually changing, perpetually becoming. The fully functioning person lives in the present, trusts their organismic experience, remains open to new information, adjusts their self-concept as experience demands. This person exhibits 5 characteristics: openness to experience, existential living, organismic trusting, experiential freedom, creativity, no defensiveness, no rigidity, congruence between experience and self-concept. The direction constitutes the good life. This aligns with his earlier work. The 19 propositions describe the organism as having one basic tendency: to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. The actualizing tendency is innate. Given the right conditions, people naturally move toward growth, development, fulfillment of potential. They don't need to be fixed by an expert. They need an environment that removes obstacles. Therapist as gardener, not mechanic. Create conditions for growth, don't impose change. Now his ideas penetrate education, organizational leadership, international conflict resolution. The person-centered approach finds application in multiple domains. Student-centered learning in classrooms, group-centered leadership in businesses, person-centered communication in diplomacy. He argues that a person cannot teach another person directly, can only facilitate another's learning. This follows from his personality theory. Everyone exists in a constantly changing world of experience, in which they are the center. Each person reacts and responds based on perception and experience. What the student does is more important than what the teacher does. The focus must be on the student. Background and experiences of the learner are essential to how and what is learned. Each student processes information differently depending on what they bring to the classroom. A person learns significantly only those things perceived as being involved in the maintenance or enhancement of the structure of self. Relevancy to the student is essential. The classroom must allow students to solve real-world problems, think critically, learn at their own pace, work independently, use creativity. Students become self-directed learners, able to adapt to changing situations, find solutions to complex problems. Staff form their own programs, generate their own revenues. Rogers and his wife Helen moved to Southern California. He's grown disillusioned with university life, frustrated with institutional conflicts. At the WBSI, he can focus on applying person-centered principles to broader contexts. 1968, he helps found the Center for Studies of the Person in La Jolla. He remains there for the rest of his life, doing therapy, giving speeches, writing, facilitating encounter groups, leading workshops around the world. Between 1974 and 1984, Rogers, his daughter Natalie Rogers, and psychologists Maria Bowen, Maureen O'Hara, and John Wood convene a series of residential programs in the United States, Europe, Brazil, Japan. The person-centered approach workshops focus on cross-cultural communication, personal growth, self-empowerment, learning for social change. Rogers demonstrates that unconditional positive regard, empathy, and congruence, the same growth-promoting conditions useful in therapy, can enhance communication and understanding among antagonistic groups. He leads workshops for groups of 100 to 800 participants, creates environments where people can encounter each other authentically, drop defenses, express genuine feelings, reduce fear, build trust. Rogers publishes Carl Rogers on Personal Power with Delacorte. The book explores the political implications of the person-centered approach, not partisan politics, but how power and influence are distributed in all human relationships. Rogers argues that trusting people, sharing power, facilitating rather than directing, these principles threaten hierarchical structures. Authoritarian systems depend on experts who know what's best for others. Person-centered approaches undermine that model. If individuals can direct their own growth, if clients can determine their own therapy goals, if students can guide their own learning, what happens to the authority of professionals? Rogers doesn't shrink from the implications. He embraces them. The person-centered approach is revolutionary precisely because it redistributes power. More personal and philosophical than his earlier works, he reflects on his life, his beliefs, his hopes for humanity. He calls for a more person-centered, humane future. The book ends with that vision, not techniques, not procedures, a way of being. The therapist's attitudes matter more than methods. The teacher's relationship with students matters more than curriculum. The leader's trust in team members matters more than control systems. Being genuine, accepting, empathic, these aren't skills you practice, then set aside. They're ways of existing in the world. A separate study by Hagbloom, published in Review of General Psychology, Volume 6, Number 2, in 2002, uses 6 criteria, including citations, recognition, scholarly impact. The study identifies the 100 most eminent psychologists of the 20th century. Rogers ranks 6th overall, second among clinical psychologists after Freud. The 6 ahead of him, B.F. Skinner, Jean Piaget, Sigmund Freud, Albert Bandura, Leon Festinger. Then Rogers, his influence documented, measured, confirmed. His final trip to the Soviet Union, where he conducts workshops promoting communication and creativity. He's impressed by awareness of his work among Russians. February 4th, 1987. Rogers dies suddenly in San Diego after surgery for a fractured pelvis bone. He fell, broke his hip. The surgery seemed successful. Then cardiac arrest. He was 85 years old. Before Rogers, therapy was diagnosis and treatment. Patient comes to expert. Expert identifies pathology. Expert prescribes intervention. Patient follows instructions or resists. The therapist holds power, determines direction, interprets meaning. Rogers inverted the model. Client, not patient. Facilitator, not expert. The person seeking help knows their experience better than anyone else. The therapist creates conditions. The client does the work. This sounds obvious now because Rogers won. The person-centered approach became so influential that its assumptions permeate contemporary therapy across theoretical orientations. Even therapists who don't identify as Rogerian use empathy, unconditional positive regard, congruence as foundational attitudes. Research consistently shows the therapeutic relationship predicts outcomes better than specific techniques. Rogers was right about what matters. Prescribe solutions. The model failed. Clients who improved weren't following his advice. They were finding their own answers. Children who healed weren't the ones accepting their parents' conditions. They were the ones developing internal validation. Rogers documented the pattern. He measured outcomes. He recorded sessions. He compared what therapists did with what actually helped. The evidence forced him to question his training. Otto Rank's influence mattered. Jesse Taft's relationship therapy shifted emphasis from past content to present self-insight. But Rogers went further. He didn't just adopt Taft's techniques. He built a complete theory explaining why relationship therapy worked. The 19 propositions in 1951 weren't borrowed. They synthesized 12 years of clinical observation with phenomenological philosophy from Combs and Snigg, incorporated Rogers' agricultural training and experimental methodology, applied his background in progressive education from Teachers College. The theory integrated multiple streams into a coherent framework. Not multiple drives competing for dominance like Freud proposed. Not stimulus response conditioning like behaviorists assumed. One drive, growth, development, enhancement. The organism naturally moves toward fulfillment of potential when conditions permit. What blocks this tendency? Incongruence, the split between experienced reality and self-concept. A child experiences anger toward a parent, but learns anger is unacceptable. Love means suppressing negative feelings. Good children don't get mad. The child can't admit the anger into awareness. The anger doesn't disappear. It gets denied symbolization, distorted, pushed outside the self-concept. The child develops a self-image. I am loving and obedient. The actual experience, I'm angry and resentful. The gap between the two creates tension. The child becomes anxious without knowing why. Defenses multiply. The organism spends energy maintaining the distortion rather than actualizing potential. The child internalizes conditions of worth. I am valuable when I perform correctly, worthless when I fail. These interjected values become part of self-structure even though they contradict organismic experience. The person lives from an external locus of evaluation, constantly checking whether others approve, never trusting their own judgment. Congruence becomes impossible. The self-concept is built on others' expectations, not direct experience. Instead, you create conditions where the client can revise their self-concept based on organismic experience. How? Unconditional positive regard. The client experiences acceptance without conditions. For possibly the first time in their life, they encounter someone who values them regardless of what they say, feel, or do. This challenges the introjected belief that worth is conditional. The client begins questioning, maybe I don't need to perform correctly to be valuable. Maybe my feelings are acceptable even when others disapprove. Maybe I can trust my own experience. This clarifies confused emotions, makes implicit feelings explicit, helps the client symbolize experiences previously denied awareness. When the therapist says, you seem to feel angry when you talk about your father, and the client responds, yes, I guess I am angry, something shifts. The client admits into awareness a feeling previously suppressed. The self-concept expands. The incongruence decreases. Inner experience matches outer presentation. No facade, no professional mask. The client encounters a real person who trusts their own feelings, expresses genuine responses, remains transparent. This demonstrates what psychological health looks like. The client sees you can be real and still be acceptable. You can express difficult feelings and the relationship survives. You can trust your experience and function effectively. Over time, with repeated exposure to these conditions, the client's self-concept becomes more flexible. Experiences previously denied can be symbolized and integrated. The gap between self-concept and organismic experience narrows. Congruence increases. Anxiety decreases. The client develops internal locus of evaluation, trusts their own judgment, stops seeking constant external approval. The actualizing tendency resumes. Growth happens naturally. The client becomes more open to experience, lives more fully in the present, trusts their organismic responses, feels experiential freedom, exhibits creativity. These are characteristics of the fully functioning person Rogers described. Not because he used special techniques, but because the conditions were present. The client felt understood, accepted, met authentically. That was sufficient. This contradicted psychoanalytic assumption that deep personality change required lengthy treatment uncovering unconscious conflicts. Rogers showed change could happen faster when you stopped interpreting and started listening. When you stopped trying to fix the client and started trusting the client's actualizing tendency. Organizations. Employees perform best when leaders share power, invite participation, trust team members' judgment rather than micromanaging. Conflict resolution. Antagonistic groups find common ground when facilitators create safe spaces for authentic encounter where people can express genuine feelings without fear of judgment, where unconditional positive regard allows former enemies to see each other's humanity. Rogers tested these applications. He didn't just theorize. He implemented person-centered leadership at the Chicago Counseling Center, shared administrative power with staff, trusted them to direct their own work. He taught student-centered courses at universities, let students choose topics, evaluated learning through self-assessment rather than grades. He facilitated encounter groups with hundreds of participants, created environments where cross-cultural communication and personal growth happened naturally. The workshops in Northern Ireland brought Protestants and Catholics into the same room. Initial hostility, rigid positions, mutual suspicion. But when Rogers established conditions of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, when participants felt safe enough to express genuine feelings, to listen without judgment, to encounter each other as humans rather than enemies, something shifted. Not instant resolution, not elimination of real conflicts, but reduction of fear, building of trust, recognition of shared humanity, progress toward peace. Workshops with blacks and whites during apartheid, intense racial tensions, historical injustices, present oppression. Rogers didn't lecture about reconciliation. He created conditions where people could talk, or really talk, honestly about their experiences, their pain, their anger, their fear. Unconditional positive regard meant white participants had to sit with black participants' rage without defending, justifying, explaining. Black participants had to encounter white participants' humanity without dismissing it. Empathic understanding meant each person tried to grasp the other's reality as if it were their own. Congruence meant people spoke truth, dropped facades, revealed real feelings, painful conversations, difficult encounters, but genuine contact, the beginning of change. Authoritarian systems depend on power hierarchies, on experts who know best, on leaders who direct subordinates. Person-centered approaches undermine those structures. If you trust people to direct their own growth, you can't simultaneously maintain top-down control. If you believe the organism naturally actualizes given right conditions, you can't justify forcing compliance. If you accept people unconditionally, you can't impose conditions of worth. The approach is inherently democratic, egalitarian, anti-authoritarian. Rogers embraced this. He saw the person-centered approach as revolutionary not just in therapy, but in society. He wasn't simply a therapist developing techniques. He was a humanist, proposing a vision of how humans could relate to each other, how institutions could function, how society could organize itself. The vision rested on a fundamental assumption about human nature. People are trustworthy. Given freedom from threat and conditions of worth, given an environment offering empathy, acceptance, and genuineness, people naturally move toward constructive behavior. They don't need external control. They self-regulate. They grow toward their potential. Behaviorists saw humans as blank slates shaped by environmental contingencies. Religious traditions saw humans as fallen, sinful, requiring moral instruction and divine intervention. Rogers rejected these premises. His clinical experience, 12 years at Rochester, decades at Ohio State, Chicago, Wisconsin, La Jolla, working with thousands of clients across diverse populations, convinced him people have innate tendency toward growth, health, constructive functioning. Pathology results not from inherent defects, but from environments imposing conditions of worth, blocking the actualizing tendency, creating incongruence between experience and self-concept. This explains why Rogers emphasized conditions over techniques. You can't force growth. You create environments where growth happens naturally. The gardener doesn't make plants grow. The gardener provides soil, water, sunlight. The plant does the growing. Similarly, the therapist doesn't make clients change. The therapist provides unconditional positive regard, empathic understanding, congruence. The client does the changing. Trust the process. Trust the organism. Trust the actualizing tendency. Results showed slightly higher discharge rates, slightly better personality development, but no significant overall improvement. Establishing contact with patients proved difficult. Many refused to speak or talked in monologues. Rogers concluded, behind the curtains of silence and hallucination and strange talk and hostility and indifference, there is in each case a person. If we are skillful and fortunate, we can reach that person, can live often for brief moments only in a direct person-to-person relationship. He didn't claim the approach cured schizophrenia. He insisted every person deserves to be encountered with unconditional positive regard, regardless of diagnosis. Rogers countered by developing measurement tools. The Barrett-Leonard Relationship Inventory in 1962 separated level of regard from unconditionality of regard, created subscales for empathy and congruence. Subsequent research confirmed the therapeutic relationship predicts outcomes across multiple therapy approaches. Meta-analyses, systematic reviews, empirical studies spanning decades show empathy, unconditional positive regard, and therapist congruence correlate with positive therapeutic change. Not perfectly, not universally. Some clients need more psychoeducation, more challenge, more structure. Different people need different things. But for most clients, The relationship matters more than technique. Rogers was fundamentally correct. His influence reshaped multiple fields. Thomas Gordon's parent effectiveness training taught parents to communicate with children using empathy, iMessages, active listening, unconditional positive regard. Millions of families worldwide. Eugene Gendlin's focusing method taught clients to attend to bodily felt senses, access implicit experiencing, use phenomenological awareness therapeutically. Marshall Rosenberg's student at Wisconsin developed nonviolent communication, a framework for compassionate dialogue based on Rogerian principles. These applications extended Rogers' insights beyond therapy rooms into homes, schools, communities. Curricula emphasizing critical thinking, problem solving, self-directed inquiry replaced rote memorization and standardized testing in progressive schools. Teachers trained to facilitate rather than lecture, to trust students' intrinsic motivation rather than imposing external rewards and punishments. Educational research building on Rogers' theories showed student-centered classrooms enhance motivation, creativity, academic achievement when implemented properly. Not every classroom. Implementation matters. But the principle holds, students learn better when treated as responsible agents capable of directing their own learning. Leaders trained to share power, invite participation, trust employees' judgment. Hierarchical command and control structures gave way to flatter organizations with distributed decision-making. Not everywhere. Many organizations remained authoritarian. But the alternative existed because Rogers demonstrated it could work. It documented evidence from the Chicago Counseling Center showing person-centered administration produced better outcomes than traditional hierarchical management. 1928, fresh PhD, confident in Freudian framework. 1930 to 1940, 12 years watching the framework fail. Clients improving without following therapeutic advice. Children healing when allowed to direct their own process. Families changing when relationships shifted from conditional to unconditional acceptance. Rogers documented patterns. He measured outcomes. He recorded sessions. He compared what therapists did with what actually helped. The evidence forced theoretical revision. They defend their training, rationalize failures, blame clients for not improving. Rogers questioned his assumptions. When the evidence contradicted his theory, he changed the theory. Scientific approach, agricultural training, and experimental methods. Measure, observe, adjust, repeat. Over 12 years, the adjustments accumulated into a complete theoretical reorientation. Rogers absorbed Combs and Snig's concept of the phenomenal field, the idea that each person lives in a constantly changing world of experience perceived uniquely from their own frame of reference. Reality isn't objective. Reality is experienced. What matters isn't what actually happened, but how the person perceived what happened. The therapist can't know the client's reality by interpreting from external theory. The therapist must enter the client's frame of reference, see from inside, understand experience as the client experiences it. This required laying aside preconceptions, listening without judgment, reflecting without interpreting. Phenomenological method applied to therapy. Biological observation. Plants grow toward light. Animals adapt to environments. Humans develop skills, expand capacities, seek fulfillment. This happens automatically when conditions permit. What blocks it? Threat, conditions of worth. Environments requiring the organism to deny its own experience to maintain others' approval. The child who experiences anger learns anger is unacceptable. To keep parental love, the child suppresses anger, denies its symbolization, develops self-concept. I'm never angry. The organism's actualizing tendency gets diverted into maintaining this false self-concept, rather than developing genuine potential. Remove the threat, offer unconditional acceptance. The organism resumes natural growth trajectory. Start with phenomenal field. Individuals exist in continually changing world of experience of which they are center. Add perception. Organism reacts to field as experienced and perceived. Perceptual field is reality for the individual. Add organism as organized whole. The organism reacts as organized whole to phenomenal field. Add basic tendency. Organism has one basic tendency in striving to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. Add behavior. Behavior is basically goal-directed attempt of organism to satisfy needs as experienced in field as perceived. Continue through all 19 propositions. The result, complete theory of personality development, psychological functioning, therapeutic change. If incongruence between self-concept and experience causes anxiety, then reducing incongruence should reduce anxiety. Test it. Create conditions of unconditional positive regard, empathic understanding, congruence. Measure anxiety before and after. Compare to control group. Rogers did this. Published results. Other researchers replicated. The predictions held. Not perfectly, not universally, but consistently enough to establish empirical support. Rogers insisted on empirical validation. Unlike psychoanalysts who relied on case studies and theoretical elaboration, Rogers recorded sessions, transcribed conversations, developed measurement instruments, conducted controlled studies. He pioneered psychotherapy research. Before Rogers, therapy was art, intuition, clinical judgment. Rogers made it science, measurable, testable, falsifiable. He welcomed criticism, invited scrutiny, shared recordings publicly. First therapist to do this, revolutionary transparency. In the 1957 paper on necessary and sufficient conditions, he stated clearly, these are hypotheses. Test them. Prove them wrong if you can. Scientific stance, contrast with Freud, who dismissed criticism as resistance, or behaviorists, who ignored subjective experience as unmeasurable. Rogers engaged honestly with evidence, revised views when data demanded, maintained intellectual integrity throughout his career. This integrity explains his influence. Rogers wasn't just smart. Many psychologists are smart. He wasn't just a good writer. Many psychologists write well. Rogers combined rigorous empiricism with profound respect for human experience, scientific methodology with humanistic values, theoretical sophistication with practical application. He built a complete system, tested it empirically, demonstrated effectiveness, trained others, documented outcomes, invited replication, acknowledged limitations, refined continuously based on evidence. Comprehensive approach, professional, scientific, humane. Hagbloom's study used 6 criteria: citations in professional journals, citations in textbooks, recognition in nomination surveys, familiarity ratings, obituary length, mention in introductory psychology textbooks. Rogers scored high on all 6. His work gets cited constantly. Textbooks cover his theories. Surveys recognize his contributions. Obituaries documented his impact. Introductory courses teach his concepts. Comprehensive influence across multiple measures, but comparable impact on the field. If you study clinical psychology, you study both Freud and Rogers. You might reject their theories, but you can't ignore their contributions. He facilitated dialogues between antagonistic groups, created conditions where mutual understanding could develop, demonstrated that empathy and unconditional positive regard work at group level just as they work at individual level. Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, blacks and whites in South Africa, Americans and Soviets during Cold War. Rogers entered hostile environments, established psychological safety, invited authentic encounter, not always successful, not always transformative, but often enough to make difference. Testimonials suggest his workshops helped foster democratization in several countries, actual political impact beyond academia, rare for psychologists. Principles taught worldwide, applications spanning therapy, education, organizational development, conflict resolution, parenting, communication. The person-centered approach became so influential, its assumptions feel obvious. Of course, therapists should be empathic. Of course, teachers should respect students. Of course, leaders should trust employees. These weren't obvious before Rogers. They were radical departures from expert knows best models dominating institutions. Rogers made them obvious through decades of clinical work, empirical research, theoretical articulation, practical demonstration, measured outcomes, theoretical integration, empirical testing, continuous refinement, scientific rigor combined with respect for subjective experience. This process led to the phenomenal field concept, the 19 propositions, the theory of congruence and incongruence, the identification of necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change. The theory emerged from evidence, not ideology. Rogers followed data where it led, even when it contradicted his training. Parents who loved conditionally, teachers who approved only achievement, peers who accepted only conformity. You learned to suppress genuine feelings, present false self, seek external validation. The gap between who you are and who you pretend to be widened. Defenses multiplied. The actualizing tendency got diverted into maintaining the false image rather than developing genuine potential. Seek environments providing unconditional positive regard. Find relationships where acceptance isn't conditional on performance. Encounter people who demonstrate empathy, trying to understand your experience as you experience it. Connect with individuals showing congruence, whose inner experience matches outer presentation. In such environments, you can begin revising your self-concept based on organismic experience rather than introjected values. You can admit previously denied feelings into awareness. You can develop internal locus of evaluation, trusting your own judgment rather than constantly seeking others' approval. You can move toward congruence, the gap narrows, anxiety decreases, the actualizing tendency resumes. You become more open, more present, more trusting of your own experience, fully functioning. The evidence from 85 years of living, 60 years of professional work, thousands of recorded therapy sessions, dozens of published books and articles, international workshops, empirical research, systematic measurement, it works. Not for everyone, not perfectly, but consistently enough to change psychology, reshape therapy, influence education, impact society. Soil core samples from the site of the Chicago Counseling Center, lab analysis showing layers of compressed earth corresponding to foundation work in 1945, chemical signatures matching 1950s building materials. Archaeologists confirm this is where Rogers built the institution that produced the data underlying modern person-centered practice. Physical proof. The laboratory existed, the recordings happened. The research was conducted, the evidence accumulated. Rogers didn't invent his theory from abstract speculation. He built it from documented observation of real people in real therapy sessions over real decades in this actual building on this specific ground. How to identify incongruence, how to seek conditions allowing revision, how to trust the actualizing tendency, how to become congruent. The process changes how you see reality because reality is phenomenal field, experienced world perceived existence. Change the lens through which you perceive, reality shifts, not the external world, your encounter with it. Rogers understood this. He spent 60 years demonstrating it works. You think you know who you are? Check the construction, measure the gap, seek the conditions, trust the organism.